It is remarkable how quickly drones have proliferated into almost every facet of war. No, I am not just talking about Operation Spiderweb here, which did make major headlines. I am also talking about the Frontlines, and the reconnaissance drones that overlook them, and basic quadcopters that also defend them, and the massive barrages of one-way drones that seem to hit Ukrainian cities every few days, and the drones that Ukraine sends right back at Russia. Heck, if anyone thought that this was only limited to Ukraine, Israel's 21st century version of a combined arms maneuver against Iran should have erased that notion. Consequently, a critical question for military planners now, and for the foreseeable future, is how to integrate drones into one's broader war plan. And, just as important, how to defend against opposing drone assaults without breaking the bank. To learn more about these pressing issues, I sat down with Joshua Schwartz, an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon University's Institute for Strategy and Technology. Not coincidentally, his research focuses on emerging drone technology. Moreover, he recently co-authored an op-ed in Foreign Affairs alongside Michael Horowitz, who served as the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Force Development and Emerging Capabilities during the Biden administration, and Lauren Kahn, who is a senior research analyst at the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. They collectively argue that the United States is underinvesting in drone technology given what the current battlefield dictates. There were a ton of topics that we needed to cover, including 3 separate areas in Ukraine alone. But I started by asking about the front lines in Ukraine, given that it is the most pressing topic. Where do you see the offense versus defense balance with drones on the front lines today?
So there are many offensive advantages associated with drones. For example, it's oftentimes much cheaper to conduct drone attacks than it is to defend against drone attacks. Oftentimes, defenders are using missiles that cost several $100,000 each to destroy drones that maybe cost a couple of hundred or a couple of $1,000 each. And so you see that asymmetry between offense and defense on the front lines, and you also see it in a more severe way deep behind enemy lines when countries are using drones to attack cities, which is a point that we're going to get to a little bit later in the conversation.
But on net, you think that along the front lines, the situation is more advantageous to the defense than the offense.
Absolutely. So the main effect that I think drones are having on the front lines is to increase the chance of stalemates developing. And they do this in 2 ways. First, drones provide countries with many eyes in the sky that they can use to identify enemy troop movements, which is having the effect of reducing the probability of surprise attacks actually being successful. And then second, whenever enemy troops are trying to maneuver on the front lines to take more territory, they're being met by a large quantity of relatively precise drones, which is making it very difficult for those soldiers to advance. So those 2 effects in combination are making it very hard for countries to actually advance on the battlefield, making a stalemate more likely.
And is that what we're seeing right now with the Russian offensive for the last year or so?
Definitely. So drones haven't made it impossible for Russia to advance on the battlefield, but what they have done is make it extremely costly for Russia to do so and make their advance incredibly slow. And in fact, drones are estimated to be causing 70% of the casualties on the front lines. So more than artillery fire, small arms fire, conventional missile fire, or tank fire, which I think is a really striking statistic demonstrating the impact that drones are having in the largest land war in Europe since World War II.
You know, that reminds me of something I learned while I was at the NATO summit a few weeks ago that speaks to the evolution of this conflict as it relates to drones. At the beginning of the war, the majority of casualties that Ukraine would suffer would be lower body injuries. And if you think about how artillery shells work, this will make sense. Normally, soldiers are not taking artillery shells to the face. Rather, artillery shells are landing around them, and then there's an explosion, and that explosion will cause the damage, either via the explosion itself or shrapnel coming out. And if you think about the way that the explosive power works, it's coming from the ground and pushing out to the sides, which means ultimately most of that shrapnel is going to be hitting the lower body. Fast forward a few years, and now drones are everywhere on the battlefield. And if you think about the way that a drone is going to attack someone, it is going to attack them from above, and it's not trying to land at their legs. It is trying to go for a direct hit, which means ultimately hitting the upper body. And that is why now Ukraine suffers a majority of casualties to the upper body, no longer the lower body.
That reminds me of an interesting finding in political science, that over time, fatalities in war are declining. And you might think that's because war is on the decline and war is getting nicer, but unfortunately, that's not really the case. It's just the case that military medicine is getting better, and so a greater percentage of soldiers are surviving their wounds. But we might wonder whether drones are undermining these dynamics by causing more upper body injuries.
Yeah, that's something that they didn't tell us. We just know that the ratio has changed over time. And trying to get a real answer to that question is going to be difficult, probably until the war ends, because of obviously there being this incentive to manipulate the information space and make it seem like everything is fine on one end and everything is really horrible on the other side. So that's probably something that we're going to have to look at in the future and see if these attacks on the upper body are harder to treat because there's more important parts of the human body on the upper body than the lower body. But I think we should transition now to the discussion on what's going on with Ukrainian cities. You mentioned at the top that the dynamics in the cities are different than the dynamics on the front lines, where the front lines are more defensively oriented, but the cities are more offensively oriented. You can go into a little bit more detail about what's going on there?
There's a large cost asymmetry between defending against drone attacks on cities and conducting those attacks. For example, while Ukraine primarily uses Patriot missiles to defend against ballistic missile attacks, they occasionally use them to try and down Russian drones. And those Patriot missiles cost $4 million per interceptor, whereas the kinds of Shahed suicide drones that Russia is using to conduct those attacks cost well under $100,000 each.
Well, then a natural question, it would seem, is what would be a more cost-effective way to handle this sort of problem?
Let me give you 4 examples of cost-effective options. The first option is jamming the connection between the drone and its pilot. And this is a strategy that we've seen both Russia and Ukraine really eagerly adopt on the battlefield. There is a ubiquity of electronic warfare on the battlefield, which has caused real problems for drone operators. A second option, and a creative option, would be for countries to start using drones to try and destroy other drones. And you've actually seen some very initial evidence of this in the Russia-Ukraine war, where you've been able to observe some select drone-on-drone dogfights. But if you could use cheap drones to destroy other cheap drones, then that would help solve the cost asymmetry problem. A third option would be to use directed energy weapons to destroy other drones. And though the startup costs of setting up this technology would be high, on a per shot basis, it would be relatively cheap to use this technology to destroy other drones. A fourth option would be to develop cheaper interceptor missiles that, instead of costing $4 million or more, would cost well under $1 million. And though there'd still be a cost asymmetry for using these kinds of interceptors against cheap drones, at least that cost asymmetry would be much smaller.
Those all sound great, but you were telling me earlier today about the counter strategies and the counter strategies that come along with these sorts of solutions.
Absolutely. There's always a cat and mouse game between the offense and defense. Let me use jamming as an example. Because of the rise of jamming on the battlefield, countries have adapted to this by deploying so-called wired drones that are connected to their pilot via a very thin fiber optic cable. And while this makes them impervious to jamming, it does create other problems. For example, these wired drones have shorter ranges, and they oftentimes can get tangled in things like trees or power lines. So it's not a cure-all solution, but it does help protect against jamming. In the long term, then, the rise of jamming is putting pressure on countries to develop more autonomous drones that would neither be vulnerable to jamming, nor would they have to be wired and have these kinds of range restrictions.
And then there is one more solution that's a little bit more proactive.
One more aggressive strategy would be to actually attack the factories behind enemy lines that produce these drones. And in fact, Ukraine has tried on multiple occasions to use their own cheap drones to destroy Russian drone factories deep inside Russian territory.
Well, that provides a nice transition point to our third main topic as it relates to Ukraine, which is Operation Spiderweb, or alternatively, depending upon how you want to translate it, Spider's Web. This was the splashier attack that occurred at the beginning of June, where Ukraine had smuggled drones inside of Russia and then used those drones to strike Russian air bases deep inside of Russia and destroy a whole bunch of very valuable bombers. What I think is interesting about this case is that the concerns go well above and beyond what you might have from a standard war. Obviously, this particular operation happened in the broader context of a broader war, but you could imagine a standalone single attack that is just intended to cause a bunch of damage to a particular country because they left a bunch of very valuable equipment lying out in the open. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about what this tells us regarding the strategic vulnerability of countries more generally in the drone era.
One danger that countries that rely too heavily on expensive legacy systems face is that they may not be able to maintain the costs of a war financially or politically over time. For example, Operation Spider's Web involved drones that cost a couple of $1,000s each, whereas the Russian aircraft that were destroyed cost well over $100 million. And even for a relatively wealthy country like Russia, those kinds of financial losses are hard to sustain in longer wars of attrition. A second point I'd make is that while Ukraine's attack was very tactically effective in that it destroyed many advanced Russian aircraft, its strategic effectiveness is a little bit more questionable. For instance, if the goal was to convince Russia to back down from the war, then it certainly has not had that effect. In fact, Russia has doubled down and conducted some of the largest drone attacks in the conflict to date. So I think this brings up the larger question of whether drones are able to achieve their strategic effects. And since we're still in the early stages of drone warfare, I think that's very much an open question. A third lesson we can learn from Ukraine's attack is that there's a large asymmetry in manufacturing times between cheap drones and advanced legacy platforms. Estimates suggest that it's going to take Russia years to recover from the attack and rebuild their degraded bomber fleet, whereas the drones that Ukraine lost in the attack can be replaced very quickly.
Going back to that comment about coercive capacity, there's another data point that we have recently, which is Israel's attack on Iran. But you think that there's something that's different about this one, right?
One thing to remember about Operation Spider's Web is that it just involved the use of drones in attacking legacy platforms. The Israeli attack on Iran is a bit different in that it involved both the use of cheap drones and expensive legacy platforms. So what Israel did in the very early stages of the war was use cheap drones to knock out many of Iran's air defense systems. And that then cleared the way for crewed Israeli aircraft to drop much bigger bombs than any drone could on some of Iran's most sensitive nuclear sites, such as the Natanz facility.
I wonder what the designer of the F-16 would think about you describing the weapon as crude.
Well, they may be crude weapons, but the bluntest instrument used in the conflict against Iran was the $2 billion B-2 bombers that America utilized to drop 30,000-pound bombs on the Fordow nuclear facility. And it's important to remember that drones simply do not have the payload capacity currently to drop bombs that large. And so if you want to be able to effectively destroy or degrade targets that are deeply buried underground, you're still going to need a crewed aircraft in the modern era.
Well, continuing with the theme of crude versus more precise instruments, as well as the topic of the United States, let's get into the meat of the op-ed. Tell me a little bit about what is going on with U.S. investment in drones right now.
So the US recently launched something called the Replicator Initiative, which is an increase in investment in these kinds of low-cost drones. And the first iteration of the initiative involves spending about $500 million. And while that seems like a lot, it's actually only about 0.05% of the entire Department of Defense budget. And so one of the key points that we argue for in the op-ed is that America should be increasing by at least tenfold its investment in low-cost military systems, because it's currently spending tens of billions of dollars on legacy platforms, but underinvesting in the kinds of low-cost drones that we're now seeing play an outsized role in modern warfare.
Well, let's pretend for a moment that I am a 70-year-old inside of the Pentagon and I am very set in my ways. Convince me that there are going to be serious problems if the United States does not make a serious investment in drones.
I'd argue there are two main risks if the US continues to underinvest in cheap drones. The first risk is that in a longer war of attrition, if the US is overdependent on expensive systems, and many of them are destroyed in the early phases of a conflict, the US may lack the financial or political capital to be able to sustain that war over the long term. And then the second risk relates to the asymmetry in manufacturing times between cheap drones and legacy systems. If a large quantity of US legacy systems are destroyed in the early to mid stages of a conflict, then it might take several months and even potentially years for the US to recover from that blow. And in the meantime, its adversary may be able to take advantage of it by scaling production of cheap and easy to produce drones.
Okay, let's go on the opposite extreme and pretend that I am a 35-year-old tech bro, and I am absolutely convinced that the only thing that the United States should be investing in is drones. Convince me I'm wrong now.
I do think it would be a mistake for the United States to completely divest from its legacy platforms. For all of their advantages, drones still have restrictions in terms of their payload capabilities, their range capabilities, and their stealth capabilities. And so if the US wants to be able to continue to destroy high-value targets like Fordo with a high degree of confidence, it's still going to need legacy platforms that have exquisite range, payload, and stealth capabilities.
Continuing along with that, if the United States wants to invest in legacy weapons, it has to be cognizant of the threats of drones coming from other countries. So which types of legacy weapons are going to be most durable to the current and continuing drone revolution?
I would argue that stealthy platforms like the B-2 bomber, like submarines, are the best kind of legacy platforms to continue to invest in, because those platforms are less likely to be able to be identified by foreign countries and to be destroyed in drone attacks. So they're more likely to actually survive the rigors of modern warfare. Though even with stealthy platforms, we should recognize that they are still vulnerable to attack when they're parked openly in airfields or in seaports. And that's exactly what we saw with Ukraine's Operation Spider's Web against Russia. Russia's bombers were parked openly in an airfield and so were able to be destroyed. But still, on balance, stealthy platforms are more likely to be able to be durable even in an era of drone warfare.
Well, I think that is a good place to stop. Joshua, thank you for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, Will. I really enjoyed the conversation.
And if you enjoyed listening to this interview, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.